1 through 9. So give your attention to the reading of God's word. It says this. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. And there were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, this fall we've been looking at these various stories where Jesus shares a meal with someone, and we're doing this because it's through these scenes around the table that you get a really fascinating window into who Jesus is and what he cares about, what his priorities are, what grace is, what his mission is. And our passage this morning that we just read is no different. It's Jesus sharing a meal with somebody, although something happens in this story that is pretty extraordinary. A woman comes into the dinner party that compels Jesus to say something about her that he doesn't say about anybody else, ever. And he says it, look at verse 9, the very end, last part. It says, "Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Meaning, Jesus just said, when my story is being told in the world, people are going to be talking about her too. And that is literally coming true as we speak this morning, because here we are as a community of people that are and we're telling the gospel, 2,000 years after the fact on the other side of the world, and we're telling her story. Pretty remarkable. What in the world did she do that prompted such a response that we're going to be talking about her for as long as anybody can think? Well, think about this. Before we answer that question, you remember how a few months ago, I can't remember exactly when it was, when the news came out that Elon Musk had chosen Memphis to be the city, the site where he's going to build his supercomputer for his AI company, XAI, and everybody was buzzing and freaking out because oh, what is this going to do for Memphis? This is going to be good for our city. It's going to provide all these jobs, and everybody's going to freaking out. X is coming to town. And then, even before that, just down the road, Ford is building this massive, what they're calling a manufacturing ecosystem called Blue Oval City. It's it's going to be the same thing and provide all these jobs. And you think about these mega companies like X or Twitter or Ford or Google or Amazon or Starbucks or Dunder Mifflin, and you have these companies that are worth billions and billions of dollars, and yet, statistically speaking, no one's going to be talking about these companies in 100 years. The stats are that 45 companies out of 1 million actually last 100 years. 45 companies out of 1 million. And you say, okay, well, maybe Ford and X and Google, maybe they're going to be one of the 45 we'll be talking about in 100 years. Maybe. Okay, what about 200 years? In 200 years from now, here are the statistics. One company out of every billion, with a B, lasts. One company out of every billion companies lasts 200 years, which means this, that in 200 years from now, nobody's going to be talking about Facebook or Apple or Starbucks or whatever. But you know who they will be talking about? This woman. We've been talking about her for 2,000 years, and we're going to keep talking about her. And so, which raises the question, okay, why? What did she do that has more lasting power than Ford, more lasting power than all of these big mega companies? Here's what she did. She grasped in the core of her being who Jesus is and what he came to do. And she shows us that through her action. She shows us two things. She shows us what Jesus deserves, and she shows us what Jesus offers. So let's learn from this woman this morning. Let's let her show us those two things, what Jesus deserves, what Jesus offers. We'll just look at them one at a time. Here's the first. How does she show us what Jesus deserves? Well, the main part of the meal scene of the story starts in verse 3. You find out in verse 3 that this takes place at a village called Bethany, which is about 2 miles away from Jerusalem. And this dinner is being hosted in the home of a man named Simon the Leper, which shows you he didn't have leprosy at the time of this story because he wouldn't have been able to host a dinner party otherwise. If you had leprosy, you had to quarantine yourself. And so scholars think, the reason why he's called Simon the Leper is because maybe he was a leper and Jesus healed him before this dinner party, or maybe he threw this dinner party and then after the fact he got leprosy and he was just kind of known. Nobody knows. All we know is that it's being hosted by this guy named Simon the Leper, which if you think about it, is not a great nickname for somebody, because here's somebody that happened to have caught this unfortunate and unflattering disease maybe once, and now that's what he's known as by everybody for all of eternity. I mean, this would be like you introducing yourself to somebody new. Hey, I'm Jonathan. My friends just call me foot fungus, though. It's kind of a thing. Or, hey, meet my friend Sarah. We just call her IBS. And it's just like, this is Simon the Leper. I don't know why he's called this, but he's called this. And poor Simon the Leper, he's throwing this party. And in the middle of dinner, verse 3, this woman comes in and pours some oil on Jesus' head, which is actually not the weird part. This would have been very normal, because you think about back then, this is 2,000 years ago, there's no showers, there's no running water, they walked everywhere, deodorant didn't exist yet, human beings stunk. People didn't smell good back then. And so if you picture 12 to 15 sweaty, unshowered human beings crammed into your living room for dinner, it's like B.O. Fest 8,000. And so what people did, what was customary, again, we looked at this a few weeks ago when we looked at Luke chapter 7. When a guest came into your home, you would pour some fragrantized oil over their heads, a little bit of oil over their heads. It was a way to honor them, but it was also a way to freshen them up a bit so they didn't reek and stink up your home. But they would do this, but here's this woman, and she doesn't pour a little bit of oil. She takes a full alabaster flask of oil, breaks it, and pours the whole thing on his head. That's the weird part, that she dumped every last drop of it. And you find out what it was. It was ointment of pure nard. Not lard with an L, but nard. I didn't know what nard was, so I had to look it up. All I could think about was the nard dog from The Office, but that's not what this is. Nard is this aromatic oil that comes from the root of a certain kind of plant that grows in India and China and Nepal. India and China and Nepal are a long ways away from Bethany. This would have been extremely hard to get. This would have been like an exotic specialty item, and it would have been crazy expensive. In fact, look at what that verse 3 uses this language. It was very costly. And the dinner guests put an actual dollar amount to it. Look at what they say in verse 5. It says, this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii. A single denarius was about the amount of a day's wages. And so 300 of them is basically, a little less than a year's annual salary. You think about what you make in a year, that's the value of this ointment. This would have been the most valuable possession that this woman owned. This would have been her life savings. This would have been her nest egg, her retirement account, her 401k. This is basically everything she owns, and she takes this thing and she breaks it and she dumps it all out on Jesus. She doesn't just give him a little dab, a little drop, a little dab like you do when you're sampling the perfume or the cologne at Dillard's. She dumps it all. Why? Here's why. Because she sees Jesus as worth it. He's more valuable to me than this jar is. He's more important to me than my life savings are. So she takes it all and she gives it to him as this gift. She says, you're worth it. It is, Jesus, you are more valuable than anything I own. You're worth losing everything over just so that I can honor you, bless you, love you. You know, in just a few moments, we're going to sing this song. The next hymn in your bulletin is When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Isaac Watts wrote it. Look at the last verse, if you have your bulletin. It says, were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Meaning, if I owned every square inch of anything that was nature, if the whole realm of nature was mine, so I owned the Amazon rainforest, I owned the Swiss Alps, I owned Jupiter and Neptune and every fish in the ocean, every species of banana, and I offered it all up to Jesus as a present. It says all of that, it's a present far too small. It's like this sad, pitiful little party favor that you're offering to Jesus. Look at what it says next. It says, love so amazing, so divine, demands my life, my soul, my all. Jesus, you are worthy of everything. And this woman gets it, and she lives it out. Now, some of you hear that and you say, see, this is why I don't like religion. It gets way too extreme. People do weird, radical things. You get this radicalized ideology in you, and people become fanatics. No. I like spirituality. I want spirituality in my life, but not like this. Not crazy spirituality. I think all things in moderation, especially with religion. I'll take a little bit of Jesus, a little bit of spirituality. Not this. Not everything. That's crazy. And I understand why you'd say that, because people can get radicalized and fanatical and do dumb things. However, I want you to consider this. You know, this story takes place really during the last week, right before the last week of Jesus' life. So he's been walking around and doing ministry for 3 years. Here's some of the things that he said over the course of these 3 years. Mark chapter 2, he's looking at a room full of people, and he says, your sins are forgiven, talking about this one person. And people in the room start muttering. They're like, what is he talking about? How can he say that? Only God can forgive people. He can't forgive people. He's claiming to be God. John chapter 8, Jesus said this famous line. He says, before Abraham was born, I am. Now, Abraham lived 2,000 years before Jesus was walking around. So he just said, hey, there's a guy that lived 2,000 years ago. Before he was even born, I am. I've always been. I've never not been. I am. It grammatically doesn't make sense, but it's just him saying I am. Then in John chapter 9, the next chapter, there's a man that comes up to Jesus and starts worshiping him. And Jesus does not say, whoa, hold your horses, buddy. You're breaking the first commandment. You shall worship no other gods but the one true God. He doesn't say that. Instead, he just receives it. And then in the chapter after that, John chapter 10, Jesus says, I and the Father are one, making himself equal with God. Over and over and over and over for 3 years, Jesus is saying, I'm not just a religious teacher. I'm not leading a political movement. I am not a spiritual life coach. I am the Lord Almighty in the flesh. I am the omnipotent creator of the universe, and I've got skin on. That's what Jesus claimed. Now, if that's what Jesus is going around and claiming for 3 years over and over and over and over, there's only two reasonable responses to that. Reasonable response number one is, I believe him. He is who he said he was. He is God in the flesh. And therefore, it is reasonable to conclude, if he is God, I do owe him everything. He's God. Every heartbeat belongs to him. Every penny I've ever earned belongs to him. Every breath belongs to him. I owe him everything because he's God. That is a reasonable conclusion. Here's the other option that you have that is also reasonable, to say, I don't believe him. To go around and say the kind of stuff that Jesus went around and said means Jesus was either clinically sick, mentally unwell, or he was intentionally lying to people, trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, which means he's either sick or evil, both bad. Both means that Christianity cannot just be another viable option right alongside of Muhammad and Buddha and Confucius and everybody else. You can't put him on par with everybody else. He's way worse. Which means that the only two reasonable options from the claim of, I am the Lord of the universe, are either worship him or reject him. Devote everything to him or want nothing to do with him. What makes zero sense is to say, yeah, I like Jesus. He's got some good things to say. I like some of his teachings. Maybe I'll go to church every now and then and hear about it. Do you notice no one in this story likes Jesus? You've got the woman who is worshiping him, giving him everything, and then look at verse 1. You have the chief priests and the scribes, and they are plotting how to kill him. Nobody just kind of likes him, because that doesn't make sense. To say the kind of things that Jesus said, it makes no sense to just kind of tolerate it. Your only options are wholehearted devotion or wholesale rejection. Which means if you consider yourself a Christian this morning, if you say, yeah, I follow Jesus, yeah, I'm a Christian, yeah, I follow him, and he is just a religious, decorative add-on to your life, just something that you kind of tack on for convenience or, whenever it's the holidays or whatever, and he's just kind of somebody that's just kind of around your life, but he is not the central thing that your whole life orbits around, where he and his understanding of the world impacts how you relate to money and how you relate to your body and how you relate to sexuality and how you relate to forgiveness and suffering and everything else. Unless he's at the center, if he's a decorative add-on, I hope you see it makes no sense. There's no real intellectual integrity in saying, I hear what Jesus is saying, and I'm just going to like it. He doesn't give you that option. It's either reject him or worship him. There's no mushy middle, which means if you consider yourself a Christian and he is just this decorative add-on, that either means you haven't really understood what his claims are or you're playing games with him. And I think Jesus would look at you and say, please stop playing games with me. Have the guts to pick a side and commit to either wholehearted devotion or wholesale rejection, because this in-between, maybe liking thing doesn't make any sense. That's different from someone who's trying to make sense of the truth claims of Jesus. If you're trying to figure out, okay, who is Jesus? What did he say? How do I make sense of that? That's different. That takes time. That takes processing. But as you're processing and wrestling with that, just know this path goes down a road that only leads to one of two destinations: worship or rejection. To like someone who just claims to be God makes no sense. Here's this woman. She hears the claims of Jesus. She takes them seriously, and she says, I'm choosing option one. I'm going to choose to worship him, give him everything. But here's the bigger question: why? What compelled her to want to do that? Well, secondly, she shows us what Jesus offers. That's what compels her. So let's look at that secondly, what Jesus offers. What happens in the story after she pours out this nard on Jesus' head? Look at verse 4. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. So there's other dinner guests present, and they are livid. What a waste. What are you doing? We could have taken this and sold this. Do you know how many mouths we could have fed? Do you know how many people we could have helped? What do you do? What a waste. And they scold her. You find out in Matthew 26 that the people that are scolding her are Jesus' disciples. The people on Team Jesus are the ones that are just laying into her, letting her have it. How does Jesus respond? Look at verse 6. Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? He defends her. He steps in and protects her from these bullies. And then look what he says next. She has done a beautiful thing to me. He validates her. They all said, this is wasteful. He says, no, this is beautiful. And then he explains why. Verse 7. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. Now, he's not saying that the poor aren't important. He's not saying, don't worry about the poor. Don't worry about taking care of them. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, you're always going to have the poor around you, which means you're never going to run out of opportunities to love them, but you will not always have me around. The clock of my very life has mere hours left to it. He's thinking about his death. You will not always have me. And then look what he says next in verse 8. He says, she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. Now, this is fascinating because back in the day, it was part of the embalming process to anoint a dead body with oil to preserve them and to anoint them. And you might remember, if you're familiar, there was a group of women who went to the tomb 3 days after Jesus had been crucified. They came with oil to anoint his body. And, of course, they were surprised when there was no body there. But that's what you did. You anointed dead bodies with oils away, part of the embalming process. No one embalmed living human beings, though. You didn't anoint living people and say, I'm preparing you for death. And yet, so this woman does this to Jesus. She's not thinking this, but Jesus takes this gift, he receives it, and he says essentially, this is going to be great for when I die. You're giving me a head start on the embalming process. Thank you. Which shows you what Jesus is thinking in this moment. He is thinking, I didn't just come to defend this woman. I didn't just come to validate this woman. I didn't come to memorialize her so that we're going to be talking about her for hundreds and hundreds of years. I came to die for this woman. Here's the scene. I think it's fascinating. You have this woman who is looking at Jesus, and she's saying, you are infinitely worth it to me. You are more precious to me than my jar of oil. And Jesus is looking at her, and he's saying the same thing. You are infinitely worth it to me. You are more precious to me than my very life. He's looking at her, and he's saying, look, because you have rebelled against God, your life is forfeit. Blood must be shed. I cannot stand to see that happen because I would lose you. So I am going to step in your place, and my blood will be shed for you so that you will be healed, so that I can have you. And he does that. On the cross, it's like his body is this alabaster jar that gets broken. And he's not pouring out perfume, he's pouring out his blood. He doesn't just give her and you and me his life savings. He gives us his life. He gives us his life, his soul, his all. Now think about this. Let's say that you have a pet goldfish named Jessica. And Jessica gets sick, and it's struggling in your little fish bowl, and you take Jessica to the vet, and the vet looks her over and says, hey, I've got good news. We can heal your goldfish. We can heal your little friend here. It's going to be very expensive, though, because we have to use these really small, specialized instruments. There's this medicine that you can only get from Sweden. We've got to import it. It's really expensive, but we can do it. We can get, here are the instruments. Here's the medicine. Here's what this is going to cost you. And you look at the bill, and it's $800,000. Most people would say, it's been nice knowing you, Jessica. But what if it's your child? And your child is sick and is dying, and you take it to the doctor, and the doctor says, we can heal your child, but it's going to be crazy expensive. We got to use these specialized instruments and the medicine from Sweden and all this stuff. You don't even need to see the bill. You just say, yes, whatever it takes, whatever it costs. We'll sell everything we own if we have to. We'll be in debt the rest of our lives. We'll eat rice every meal the rest of our lives. We'll give plasma every week. It doesn't matter. Whatever we got to do. The reason why the reactions are so different is because your child is precious to you. Whatever it takes, make it happen. When you look at the cross might be confusing to you. It might be offensive to you. Why all the gore and the blood, the agony? I don't get it. But you know what the cross is saying to you? The cross is saying, you are so precious in the eyes of God. It was worth it to him to lose everything that was dear to him in order to heal you, in order to have you. That's what the cross is saying to you and to me. You are precious. You are worth it. Despite everything about your struggles and mine, worth it. I don't know if you're anything like me. There's voices in your head that can be turned up so loud when you think about your own failures or your regrets, parts of your story that you wish weren't there, parts about yourself that you just hate, that you wish you could change. And sometimes the volume on those things are so loud that it can be all that you hear sometimes. And here's what Jesus is offering. He's offering you and me a better soundtrack to our lives. He's inviting us to believe something good, to believe that even though we have failed to love him as he deserves, even though we have failed to love our neighbors as we ought, he has not withheld his love from us. That here we are with all of our regrets and struggles and shame, and we're just messes. And he says, you are precious in my sight, and I am willing to lose everything that I hold dear in order to heal you and in order to have you. What is your response to this? Here's a response to love that is so amazing and so divine. It is to give him your life and your soul and your all. Well, consider that an invitation for you this morning. Let me pray. Father, thank you that you have not withheld from us your one and only Son. You have demonstrated with tangible historical proof that you love us to such a degree that you would give us your life and your soul and your all. And would you give us the courage and the confidence and the joy to respond in like manner, that we too might give you in return everything that you are owed, which is in fact everything. Would you do that deep work in our souls by the work of the Spirit as we hear and as we respond to your word? And we pray all this in Jesus' name.